All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. We are continuing our exploration of the realist fiction of the end of the 20th century, and now we have arrived at John Updike, a writer of what I'm calling lyrical realism, for reasons I think you'll see. This is unlike dirty realism and magical realism, which I applied to Raymond Carver and Louise Erdrich. Those were kind of official terms that were used at the time to describe those writers and other related writers. Lyrical realism is more of a term I'm applying to Updike. It's not like an official term that's been applied to him. And I'm borrowing it from an essay that was written in the 2000s by a writer named Zadie Smith, who was contrasting a more experimental fiction with what she called lyrical realism, which she thought was one of the standard types of American fiction writing in the novel and the short story. And I think that the term lyrical realism, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that shortly, particularly applies to John Updike. So who is John Updike? He lived from 1932 to 2009. He was born and raised in Shillington, Pennsylvania, so that's on the other side of Pennsylvania from where August Wilson and I are from. So we were in Pittsburgh with fences. That's western Pennsylvania. Shillington is in eastern Pennsylvania near Reading, I think, is the nearest larger city. And he often recurs to this setting in his fiction, this setting of eastern Pennsylvania, small town eastern Pennsylvania with a Protestant Dutch influence. So that's and his work is pretty diverse in setting, and even some of his later works are more sort of fantastical, and some of his works are more global. But his most noted realist fiction tends to have that as its setting. He attended Harvard, and then he studied in England to be an artist, particularly a cartoonist. Then he comes back to America, and he becomes a writer for the New Yorker magazine. That's his regular outlet for both his fiction, his short stories, and his literary criticism. And he's a very prolific writer, writes many, many short stories, many, many essays, is a poet, writes innumerable novels. I mean, they're not innumerable. One could number them, but I don't actually know how many. Let me think. Off the top of my head, around 20 novels in a lifetime, 20 or 30 novels. So very prolific, and was renowned for his short stories and his literary criticism, etc. And I think one of the ways to think about him, if you think of the authors we've read before in this course, is that he's really, I think, the heir to John Cheever. Cheever and Updike both have as their concern this life not lived in the big city, but tending to be lived in suburbs or small towns among the white middle class, the broad middle class, from the lower middle class to the upper middle class, or even Updike often charts his character sort of moving from the lower middle class to the upper middle class, but that tends to be their concern, and with an East Coast setting, and a style of lyricism, a very poetic, very richly descriptive, richly evocative writing style, very distant from the severe minimalism of a Raymond Carver, or in the generations before Carver, of an Ernest Hemingway. So I think we're starting to see kind of two poles develop in realist writing between a minimalist style and a lyrical style. So what else about Updike? He was married twice. He had 4 children, and after in the second half of his life, he lived mostly in Massachusetts, in I think a relatively small town, or at least a small city in Massachusetts. And he is he's an interesting writer. He's a polarizing writer, a controversial writer, for some of the same reasons that Philip Roth was controversial. These were both writers who were contemporaries, both born in the 30s. We're looking at those 30s births again, that silent generation that really dominated the second half of the 20th century, or the last quarter of the 20th century in American literature. And they were writers who were very interested in chronicling the changes that came about in the 60s and after, with the sexual revolution. And we looked at the kind of emancipatory, the women's movement, the kind of queer movement we see reflected in Ansel Dua's work, the women's movement we see reflected in Adrienne Rich's work. But there was a general revolution in sexual mores that wasn't necessarily political in a left-right sense. It just sort of overtook the whole culture, in which you have the development of the birth control pill, the liberalization of divorce laws, the full federal legalization of abortion, and in general, what you have is a relaxation of sexual norms across the society. The idea that you're supposed to get married to someone, a man and a woman will get married when they're, 22 years old, and they'll have children and they'll stay together all their lives. This is no longer really the expectation. You have an elevated divorce rate. You have much more potential for women to control their own reproduction, and in general, you have this sexual revolution. And Roth and Updike are both very much male chroniclers of this set of events, and they're sort of describing in their work, along with some other writers we didn't read, like Saul Bellow, for instance. They're describing in their work kind of what it is to experience this development as a man, and so their work is full of adultery. They're full of men with wives and mistresses, and all sorts of things. And Updike turns his rich, descriptive, poetic, evocative gift often to rather graphic depictions of sexuality, because another thing that's happening in this period is a relaxation of literary censorship, which I think we already talked about. That happened kind of before in the 50s and 60s, and so Updike and Roth and other writers are able to write much more graphically about sexuality in their work, which is not simply true of white male writers either. I mean, this is also applies to James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich, all of whom also write rather graphically about sexuality in their work as well. So he's been polarizing in that way. His work was seen as this sort of depiction of male entitlement, or the male gaze, as it were. There's also a sense of general kind of conservatism about Updike. He was, I think, politically a lifelong Democrat, but on the very conservative side of Democrat for most of his life. He, for instance, is notably one of the major writers to have supported the Vietnam War, he wrote about why he thought the Vietnam War was necessary to, and he's coming to this opinion when that war was largely prosecuted by a Democratic presidential administration, that it was necessary to roll back communism, for instance. And in his works, so there's a connection here between the style of his works and the politics of his work, which is that his gift, his highly poetic style, just kind of placidly, complacently seems to describe everything it registers. There's no edge of critique in Updike. That's not true. That goes too far. But just for the sake of a short lecture, permit me an exaggeration. There's no critique in Updike. His style sort of pats everything on the head and blesses it as it goes by, and literally blesses it. He's a Christian, a very devout, believing, sincere, I don't know if he's very devout, a devout, sincere Christian who's very concerned about developments within Protestant religion in his writing as well. And in fact, a lot of his fiction takes on this kind of frisson from, what does frisson mean? This shiver, this tingle up the spine that you get when you read it, because of the juxtaposition of the carnality of the sexuality he describes with also this interest in faith and spirituality. But his particular spiritual view was that everything in the created world was sort of beautiful because God made it all, and so everything would be described in this way. And that's kind of the utopian way to describe it, but the negative way to describe it is there's this complacency, this kind of laziness of intellect to his work, that he just kind of takes everything in equally and blandly, and so this middle class suburban small town lifestyle that so many other American writers from all different perspectives would want to criticize just isn't there in his work. There's no, we started this course with that interest in the outsider. There's no sense of outsiderness in Updike's work. He was not an outsider. He became an insider, a consummate insider. And I have him pictured there playing the insider's game of golf. He was very interested in golf. He even wrote a book about golf, which I haven't read. So that is John Updike. What do they say in the Norton that I excerpted? They quote him, to transcribe middleness with all its grits, bumps, and anonymities In its fullness of satisfaction and mystery, is it possible or worth doing? He asks, and the editors of the Norton Anthology say that he is arguably the most significant transcriber or creator, rather, of middleness in American writing since William Dean Howells. William Dean Howells is a 19th century writer who's in many ways the founder of realism as a tradition in American literature. So this lyric, poetic description of the middle state of life is what Updike is about. And so we have this short story separating that is about, it kind of reflects on what I was saying. We have this upper middle class couple, and they're getting divorced because the husband, and it seems like an amicable divorce, but the husband has apparently a mistress, we're told in one line, that he hopes to marry once he gets divorced. And the conflict of the story is that he has to, that the family have to break this to the children. The children who are mostly grown up or teenagers or in high school or college students, and they're all going to come home for the weekend. And the husband and wife are going to tell the children that they're going to tell them they're separating, which is kind of a euphemism. They're doing a trial separation, but they know that the marriage is breaking up and that they are going to be divorced, and they don't know how the children are going to take it. And over the course of the story, they have this kind of plan to tell them in a certain way, but it fails because the father, sorry, I don't know any of these people's names. Richard, I guess, is the father. I read this story. I've read this story multiple times. I just don't care all that much about it. But so the father, Richard, he can't stop crying at dinner. The tears just keep coming through. And so the mother tells the oldest daughter, who's home from college, and then the one son takes it kind of hard. He eats a cigarette and gets drunk on the champagne they're having with their lobster, upper middle class living. And then eventually the father takes him outside, and they come to some accord with each other emotionally. And then the father goes to pick up to the other son who's coming in from a concert and tells him, and he seems to take it well, but then at the end he kind of breaks down crying and kisses his father and asks why. And so we have this poignant epiphany. And so I think this is, I said I don't care that much about this story because I don't, but I don't think it's Updike's best work. But I do think it indicates a lot of his themes, particularly socially, which is the changing sexual mores of the upper middle class, and how divorce, which was a much bigger deal back in the middle and early 20th century, is now something that's much more casual and socially accepted. And yet it does have these costs, these emotional costs on people. And so what are the responsibilities of people in these changed circumstances? Now, there is, I think, an existential, one of the things I think, so Updike is a polarizing writer. I said you either like him or don't. I actually like Updike, though I understand the critiques of him. And I think that one of the things that is interesting about him is there is this existential dimension of his work that I think makes it more than merely the complacent recording of the narcissistic emotional travails of the most privileged classes, or maybe not the most privileged classes, but the most privileged among the middle classes, is that there's this constant concern in his work. His characters feel something that I do think people in all walks of life do feel, that I actually think probably material prosperity can't protect you from feeling, which is that time is getting away from you, and time will take away your life and everything that you love and everyone that you love. And so this sense of time and death encroaching is an important part of his work. So on the one hand we have, and I think that's another sort of frisson you get, that's FRISSON, this kind of shiver that you get from John Updike's work. comes from this contrast between prosperity and time. So we have this kind of ironical observation near the beginning of the story about how divorce followed a dramatic home improvement. And the guy and his wife, Richard and Joan, or whatever the hell their names are, they were described as having reformatted their tennis court, and how powerful they felt as they were altering and improving their tennis court on their property. Their marriage could rend the earth for fun, and yet eventually they do get divorced because somehow this change in the property arrangements that they're able to effect with their vast wealth somehow occasions some change in the emotional state between them. So there's this evocation of prosperity, and yet prosperity, no matter how rich you are, and no matter how much you can change the tennis court on your property, you're still going to die. And so Richard understands this. He's sort of doing some home improvement while he's waiting for the kids to show up to tell them about the divorce, and he thinks the bushes already needed pruning, the windward side of the house was shedding flakes of paint, rain would get in when he was gone, insects, rot, death, his family, all those he would lose, filtered through the edges of his awareness as he struggled with screw holes, splinters, opaque instructions, minutiae of metal. So this is a story, by the way, told in that limited third-person style. I think almost everything it's third person, but almost everything is filtered through Richard's consciousness. And so he, at this moment, has this, I think, genuinely poignant awareness of death. And maybe there's a relation here, too, between often in Updike you get the sense that these characters can't stay married to each other. They're always committing adultery. They're always taking many lovers as a vain way of staving off death, that sex becomes opposed to death. You don't get that. This is not a very dirty Updike story, but some of his writing is quite graphic. And you get the impression, this is true in Roth as well, that these men are sort of endlessly pursuing these erotic entanglements as a way of staving off death. And in fact, we sort of saw that too in Fences by August Wilson. That's kind of the explanation Troy gives for his adultery. So perhaps this is something of about masculine psychology or ideology in the period that a number of different writers with different ideologies and points of view are still managing to converge on. So prosperity and time. And then, so that slide was for the pro Updike position. I think this is Updike at his best, this contrast between prosperity and time and this existential dimension of his work. But there is still, even for people like me who do like Updike, and I think he's a wonderful writer of prose, of sentences, there is still this sense of complacency, this what I'm calling sentimentality and narcissism. So you see this with Richard's tears. The tears would not stop leaking through. They came not through a hole that could be plugged, but through a permeable spot in a membrane, steadily, purely, endlessly, fruitfully. So, and that sentence, I think, gives you a sense of what I mean when I say Updike is a poetic writer of prose, that we have this interest in creating arresting images that are somewhat vague. A permeable spot in a membrane. I don't know quite what that means, but it sounds good. And then we get this list of adverbs: steadily, purely, endlessly, fruitfully. The prose becomes this kind of litany, this chant. So Updike as poetic writer. And yet, there's something I understand, and this happens to people in life, probably to all of us. There's moments where we're emotionally overwhelmed and we can't stop crying. And yet, he's got to break this bad news to his kids, and yet he makes this sort of spectacle of his own sentimentality. And Updike knows this. They became, his tears, a shield for himself against these others. So that becomes a way of kind of recentering himself in the narrative, even though in his own kind of narrative, and in the way that he has to it's his children who are going to sort of suffer from something he's doing, and yet he makes himself pitiable. He makes himself pitiful. And there's also, I think Updike, I said there was no critique, but I think it's a genuinely comic image, this guy eating lobster and champagne with tears rolling down his face. I think there's a knowing comedy to it. But nevertheless, I think sentimentality and kind of narcissism, and often the 70s and 80s were spoken of often by critics across the political spectrum as being a decade of 2 decades of narcissism. But I think both the 70s and 80s were called the me decade, and it has to do with this neoliberalism, this individualism, this sense that the individual should be liberated from all constraint. Leading to possibly to this narcissism. And toward the end of the story, when he's telling his other son about the divorce in the car, he realizes his son is stunned, and he thinks to himself, or he actually says to Dickie, he says to his kid, I hate this, hate it. My father would have died before doing it to me. And so Updike is registering here that there's been this generational shift, that what individuals feel they're entitled to has changed. And one of the things I think I was trying to suggest earlier in the course is that this is a change that occurred across the culture, and it had a lot of positive effects. And it had a lot of positive effects, for instance, on members of groups that had been oppressed on the basis of gender, race, sexuality, that they would no longer stand for their oppression, that they would resist it. But or not even but, just and this shift occurred everywhere else in society. This new kind of individualism, this liberation of the individual, also affected the most privileged white males, who began to behave in a more individualistic and hedonistic, pleasure-oriented, and perhaps narcissistic way. It changed the political left. It changed the political right. You have the development of the new left, but you also have the development of this more neoliberal, individualist brand of conservatism with Ronald Reagan. So it was a culture-wide shift affecting every area of culture, I think, a change in the way people thought about themselves and their obligations to others. And it had effects that people want to see as beneficial, and it had effects that people want to see as damaging and harmful. And I think different people can come to different conclusions, but I think Updike's work, in its way, testifies to this fully as much as does the work of somebody at a completely opposite pole from Updike, like Adrian Rich. So that's John Updike. That's his lyrical realism. And that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.